Execution. It's meant to be swift and certain, but when things go wrong, they go horribly wrong. From lethal injections gone terribly awry to electric chairs sparking into flames, these are some of the most botched executions in history. Clayton Lockett's execution in Oklahoma became one of the most infamous cases of a botched lethal injection. On April 29, 2014, executioner struggled to establish an IV line, eventually inserting it into his groin area. Unbeknownst to them, the needle was not properly placed in a vein, meaning the lethal drugs leaked into his surrounding tissue rather than entering his bloodstream as intended. As the drugs took effect, Lockett's body began convulsing uncontrollably. He writhed, clenched his teeth, and even attempted to sit up, showing clear signs that he was still conscious and in extreme distress. Realizing something had gone terribly wrong, Oklahoma officials attempted to halt the execution. But by then, the damage had been done. Lockett suffered for 43 minutes before ultimately dying of a massive heart attack, a death that was anything but quick or painless. His execution sparked nationwide outrage, leading to legal challenges and a temporary moratorium on executions in Oklahoma. Executions are intended to be swift and relatively painless, but that was far from the case for Joseph Wood. Arizona opted to use a new combination of drugs, midazolam and hydromorphone, despite concerns about their effectiveness in ensuring a humane death. The results were horrifying. Rather than losing consciousness quickly, Wood remained alive for nearly 2 hours, struggling for breath. Witnesses described him gasping and snorting more than 600 times as his body fought against the effects of the drugs. His execution took so long that his attorneys filed an emergency appeal while he was still alive, asking the court to intervene. But before any action could be taken, he finally succumbed. Angel Nieves Diaz's execution in Florida became a disturbing example of what can go wrong with lethal injection. The execution team failed to properly insert the IV, causing the chemicals to be injected into his soft tissue rather than directly into his bloodstream. Instead of losing consciousness quickly, Diaz remained alive for 34 minutes, during which he showed clear signs of suffering. Witnesses reported him grimacing, gasping, and moving, despite being paralyzed by the drugs. When officials realized the execution was not proceeding as expected, they administered a second dose, but this only prolonged the ordeal rather than resolving it. An autopsy later revealed severe chemical burns on Diaz's arms, confirming that the lethal drugs had been absorbed into his tissue instead of circulating through his body properly. John Evans' execution in Alabama remains one of the most gruesome examples of a botched electrocution. The state used the electric chair, a method designed to deliver a fatal shock instantly. But instead, Evans endured a prolonged and horrific ordeal. When the first jolt of electricity was administered, sparks and flames erupted from his head, and smoke filled the execution chamber. Yet Evans was still alive. A second shock was applied, but once again, it failed to kill him. It wasn't until the third jolt, after 14 agonizing minutes, that Evans was finally pronounced dead. In what can only be described as an understatement, the prison warden later called the execution somewhat less than smooth. Pedro Medina's execution in Florida became infamous for a horrifying malfunction that underscored the dangers of electrocution. When the electric chair was activated, flames erupted from his head, shocking witnesses and filling the execution chamber with thick smoke. Rather than a quick and controlled process, Medina's death appeared chaotic and deeply disturbing. Despite this, Florida officials initially defended the execution, insisting Medina did not suffer. This incident played a key role in the eventual abandonment of the electric chair as Florida's primary execution method, leading the state to adopt lethal injection instead. Doyle Lee Hamm's attempted execution in Alabama became a disturbing example of the failures of lethal injection. Hamm, who had been diagnosed with lymphatic and cranial cancer, had severely compromised veins due to years of illness and past drug use. Despite this, Alabama proceeded with the execution, spending over 2 hours attempting to insert an IV line. The execution team struggled to find a suitable vein, repeatedly inserting needles into his legs, ankles, groin, and even near his bladder. Hamm experienced significant bleeding from multiple failed attempts, leaving him in immense pain. Eventually, the execution was called off and Hamm was returned to his cell, where he later described the ordeal as torturous. Legal challenges followed, and Alabama ultimately agreed not to attempt the execution again. Hamm remained on death row until his natural death from cancer in 2021. Romell Broom's execution by lethal injection in Ohio was an unprecedented failure. Over the course of 2 agonizing hours, the execution team repeatedly failed to find a suitable vein, sticking him at least 18 times in different areas of his body. Despite their continued attempts, the executioners were unable to establish an IV line, forcing officials to call off the execution entirely. This marked one of the rare instances in U.S. history where an inmate survived a failed execution attempt. Broom later described the experience as like torture, and legal battles followed over whether the state could attempt to execute him again, a debate that raised serious ethical and constitutional concerns. Ultimately, he remained on death row, but died of natural causes in 2020, more than a decade after the botched attempt. William Vandiver's execution in Indiana was so prolonged and gruesome that it led to the retirement of the state's electric chair, but not before he endured a horrific ordeal. The first jolt of electricity failed to kill him, as did the second, third, and fourth. It wasn't until the 5th attempt, 17 minutes after the execution began, that he was finally pronounced dead. The execution was so disturbing that one of the prison officials quit on the spot, unable to continue in their role after witnessing the event. The state quickly retired its electric chair afterward, recognizing that such a method was too unreliable and inhumane to continue using. Frank Coppola's execution in Virginia was a brutal display of the sheer force of the electric chair. To ensure the execution was effective, officials increased the voltage to an extreme level, resulting in severe burns across Coppola's body. As the current surged through him, smoke began rising from his head. While the process was relatively quick compared to other botched electrocutions, the severity of the burns and the gruesome nature of his death raised serious ethical concerns. Charles Brooks Jr. holds the distinction of being the first person executed by lethal injection in the United States. But, as with any first attempt, there were some serious growing pains. Rather than a smooth, well-rehearsed process, the execution was slow and clunky as officials figured things out in real time. The procedure took much longer than expected, with delays in administering the drugs and uncertainty about how smoothly the new method would work. Despite the awkward execution process, Brooks at least avoided the horrors of electrocution. No flames, no smoke, and no gruesome burns like in previous cases. What do you think? Should the death penalty be a thing? Or should we just let karma do its job? Let me know in the comments.